Chairman. Thank you.
Mr. Price.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Madam Ambassador, let me add my welcome to the subcommittee and congratulations on your appointment.
Thank you.
I'd like to recollect a decision you made early in your tenure, February 10th. Apparently, without any prior warning or expression of concern, the United States blocked the appointment of Salam Fayyad to become the next UN Special Representative to Libya. Now, Mr. Fayyad's qualifications for that position seem undeniable. He's former Prime Minister of the Palestinian Authority. He served as Prime Minister of the Palestinian Unity Government, has worked at the World Bank, the IMF, the Arab Bank in the West Bank and Gaza, the Federal Reserve Bank in St. Louis. He's probably the Palestinian leader with whom we have worked most productively, and the Israelis as well. Ron Dermer, the ambassador, Israel's ambassador to the U.S., called Mr. Fayyad a peace partner. The first Palestinian leader, he said, in a country in the century who cared about the Palestinians. Your statement was brief but puzzling. You seem to imply that the appointment of Mr. Fayyad would be to the detriment of Israel, and that blocking his appointment was an act of support for Israel. My question is, what happened? Did you or the administration view the blocking of Mr. Fayyad, a person who's arguably been one of the most influential and constructive Palestinians in support of the two-state solution, was that a way to support Israel? Did the Israeli government ask us to do this? Now, there was some speculation that the blocking or approval of Mr. Fayyad would be linked to a possible UN appointment for Tzipi Livni, who, of course, would also be a great asset to the UN. Haven't seen any recent reports about that. Was there any link to Fayyad's appointment to the potential appointment of Livni or another Israeli? Was Mr. Fayyad denied simply because of his nationality? Would any Palestinian have been blocked? As you know, this isn't a state representative. You don't have to be a state representative to be appointed a UN representative. So, bottom line question, is it the administration's position that support for Israel and support for the appointment of a well-qualified individual of Palestinian nationality to appoint at the UN are mutually exclusive?
Thank you, Mr. Price, for your question. I will tell you, Mr. Fayyad is what you say. He's very well qualified and is a good, decent person. I've heard great things about him, but it was not about Mr. Fayyad. It's about the fact that the U.S. does not recognize Palestine as a state. And because we don't recognize Palestine as a state, and because that is how he was presented, we did oppose that, that position. We also, at the same time, brought to the attention of the Secretary General that, you know, here you've never had an Israeli that has held that high of a position, but you are putting a Palestinian in that position, and it needs to be fair and balanced. But the reason that we opposed Mr. Fayyad is that we don't recognize Palestine as a state, and Israel, yes, supported our decision in that.
Well, that does raise two questions. A, was this to be a state representative? And B, would not that reasoning exclude anybody of Palestinian nationality simply by virtue of the status of the Palestinian Authority as certainly something considerably short of a state? But are we just saying that no Palestinian need apply?
I think at this point, since we don't recognize Palestine as a state, that is something that we are trying to be we're trying to work with Congress and what everyone has said, that we don't recognize Palestine as a state. It's the reason we're not involved in UNESCO, is because once they allowed Palestine to be a part of UNESCO, the U.S. withdrew funds or withheld funds starting in 2011. And so I'm trying to be consistent with what we've done in the past and what we continue to do. And so that is the reason that Mr. Fayyad was not, that we objected to Mr. Fayyad.
With due respect, that simply isn't an analogy. The question about UNESCO is a question that has to do with explicitly to do with its recognition and admission of Palestine as a state. You're here talking about a man's nationality, not going to be a state representative, an eminently well-qualified individual, with a background with the Israelis, the Palestinians, and the U.S. that would suggest some unique abilities. You didn't say that the Israelis directly initiated this or requested it, this was our initiative? Is this some kind of new policy that no Palestinian can possibly, as long as the Middle East, as long as the Middle East conflict is unresolved, that no Palestinian can be approved by this country to any kind of UN appointment?
Thank you, Mr. Price. What I can tell you is that we saw abusive actions happening at the UN towards Israel. And as long as those abusive actions are happening towards Israel, our job is to bring balance to the UN. And putting Mr. Fayad in that position would only have added to the bias against Israel. And that's not something we wanted to do. When one of the things I said was we have the backs of our allies. And it was important for us to realize that if Israel had been abused the way they were in the UN, that all things needed to be considered as we were dealing with that. And if we don't recognize Palestine as a state, we needed to acknowledge also that we could not sit there and put a Palestinian forward until the U.S. changed its determinations on that front.
Mr. Fortenberry.